Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader, and as you can see here, we've got another great guest on tap for you today. But for such episodes, I always add a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against a guest's political views or groups they support. But of course, as always, our topics are things that are relevant to people across the political spectrum. One of the primary goals of this show is to bridge political divides, and that involves giving practical tips on how to depolarize American politics. In fact, discussions with several of my guests on here have focused specifically on the endeavor of depolarizing. But while it's all well and good to talk about how to be less polarizing, more empathetic, how to have better conversations, and so on, we have to truly want to depolarize and make our political culture less toxic. So how do we encourage and incentivize depolarization and show that toxicity is not beneficial to anyone? Well, that's what today's guest, Phelosha Collaros, is here to talk about. Phelosha is the founder of DepolarWise, which strives to depolarize and build bridges in America through means such as educational tools, connecting people into a supportive community, and promoting the values of empathy, civil dialogue, and our common humanity. She also gave a TED Talk titled "We Need to Talk About Everyday Partisan Violence," and is currently the Vice President for Board Governance and Strategic Outcomes at St. John's College. So now, let's welcome our guest and let's get her insights into encouraging depolarization and her work with Depolarize. Please welcome Phelosha Collaros. Phelosha, thanks for coming on. How are you?
Oh, I'm great, Paul. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. So I like to start off with guests getting into the whys of what my guest does and the relation to the topic in general. So before all this public speaking and depolarize and all the stuff that you're doing now, what got you so interested in depolarization efforts in the first place? And what were some early experiences with polarization?
Yes, well, I'd actually have to say that my earliest experience with depolarization was in my DNA. It was a secret code, though. I didn't know the history of my family, that my mother, a Colombian born, now American citizen, was carrying with her until relatively recently, when she started to see some of the markers from her country, the signposts start to come about in our country around polarization and partisan violence. So my grandparents, her parents, were actually in a mixed political marriage in Colombia when La Violencia occurred, which was a partisan civil war between the liberales and the conservadores that ultimately claimed the lives of 200,000 citizens and burned the capital of Bogota to the ground. So this was a family history of ours that, as many immigrants come to this country, they don't look back at those past tragedies from the country they left. But as these signposts in this country started to come about, seeing the kind of collapse of the continuity of viewpoints and of ideological diversity and of the tolerance of each other in this country, my mother started to reveal this hidden history, and I became so fascinated by it. So I would ask her a lot of questions about the experience of herself and her parents. Some of her earlier memories were people shooting at their home because my grandfather was not in the same political party as that town. So she had experienced La Violencia. She knew it had happened, but she didn't really understand it as an adult would, as somebody who had researched it would. So we just started going back to Colombia. We made several trips where we visited libraries and archives. We spoke to historical societies, and we had the privilege of interviewing some of the last living survivors of La Violencia who were at the generation who truly saw the entire thing unfold. And that really, it was really eye-opening to me. And I'll say the similarities between Colombia and the United States in this juncture are very salient. Colombia used to be called the Athens of South America. So I really wanted to understand how that stable of a democracy could turn into a place of everyday partisan violence and really become the type of society that still struggles with the haunting of that violence to this day.
I remember reading a little bit on the DepolarWise website, you talking about your mother's and your grandparents' experience in Colombia, and it's very. Sometimes it's hard for those of us, like I'm born in the United States. I've never even been outside the country, and it can be hard for us to realize just how much worse things can get. I mean, as bad as things are now, we can look to all sorts of different historical points and throughout the rest of the world, but people already don't know enough about the US's history, and especially the history of polarization, and let alone the rest of the world. But I think it's still, just because it's another country, like you said, it's still very relevant to what's happening today for the US, and it is something that I think it's also hard for people to appreciate. Think, well, you know what, that kind of thing is never going to happen over here. It's like, but if you treat it like it's never going to happen, it will happen at some point. And it is
Exactly.
just, yeah, it's something obviously we've got to be careful about. Oh, you got something to add?
Yeah. Yeah, I was just gonna add that, one of the ways in which we dismiss in this country the polarization and violence experienced in other countries is to say, "Oh, well, that was a religious conflict," right? "Oh, that was an ethnic conflict or a racial conflict." But in Colombia, the vast majority of the people were Catholic, and the vast majority of the people were some kind of mixed, Hispanic ethnicity. So really at the heart of the framework of the conflict was the liberal conservative divide. And I think that combined with the fact that the US and Colombia have very similar histories, their founders were really inspired by the Enlightenment to create these democratic republics. They had that initial conflict within those two worldviews, right? The radical Enlightenment and the moderate Enlightenment. Colombia looked to the United States in terms of its revolution to build its society. So there's just so many historical synergies, and then there's also that present day synergy, which is we are not fractured by other identities primarily, but we're fractured by this partisan polarization. We're stacking these other
Right.
identities on top of it to widen the divide. But for us, that framework is very salient and very disturbing when we see how that played out in Colombia.
Eh, Uh, oh, you were talking about those enlightenments. Actually, funny enough, my very first guest I had on this podcast, Seth David Radwell, he actually wrote a book about those two enlightenments and how they have affected American history throughout, or America throughout its
It's
history.
an
So it's just an
excellent book,
interesting.
American Schism,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
I know
yeah,
what you're
exactly.
talking
So
about.
hey,
It's really a
full,
phenomenal book in terms of drawing out that very history.
yeah, kind of a full circle moment, I guess, for the podcast there. Definitely, and you guys can check out that episode as well. I believe it's episode 7. So it was very early on in this podcast history. But I want to move on a little bit to the work that you're doing now with DepolarWise. And I briefly described DepolarWise in the intro, but obviously I want you to talk about it in your own words, since it is your organization, or one of your organizations. So when and why did you establish Depolarize? Was there some gap that you wanted to fill in the depolarization movement that you didn't think was filled? And how does DepolarWise contribute to depolarization?
Yes, thank you. So I would say that the genesis of DepolarWise.com is really this journey that I was on personally to try to understand polarization and then what can be done about it. So as I was on that journey, I had the privilege of encountering so many people who were working in different ways as authors, like we just talked about, founding organizations, and a podcast like we're doing, just so many ways in which they were building a community and furthering this movement of bridge building and depolarization. So the heart of the project, really founding DepolarWise, was to say, look, there's this community here that is growing and wants to welcome you. Of course, when you talk about a country that has kind of pushed people very much to the binary, and that binary has become a deep identity with people, it can be very scary to step off of the binary and just not know what is in the third way there and who's going to meet you there. So as I was in discussions with people and understanding their fear and trepidation of stepping off that binary, not understanding that there was a community here that was working on these issues, and that it was accessible to them, that was the heart of the mission for Depolarize, to try to create a space where people could find this community and start their own personal journey on how they could interact with, engage with depolarization and bridge building. So the way the site is set up is to help people on their own journey and meet them with what's accessible to them, right? So if you're a big fan of podcasts, there are so many podcasts that you can check out in this space. If you want to read more about it, there are books, and there are also source recommendations of people who are making efforts to have nonpartisan news sources. You can find organizations to join once you're at that level and you're ready to jump in a more active way, and other resources to explore that will really help catalyze and further you on the journey of becoming part of this community.
I think there's, for citizens in general who are sick of the division and the polarization and the false binaries, I think it's hard for them sometimes to appreciate that there are a lot of people doing this work in depolarization, like you, for example. And it's good to see or be able to demonstrate, no, there are those people out there, and not only me, but there's all these other resources you can use, all these other people that are involved as well, that you direct them to as well. It's great to not have just, hey, come to our website, we've got a lot of content, but then you also can direct them to all these other resources that they can use as well. Especially because sometimes I think a lot of times, for lack of a better term, depolarization can sometimes feel very woo-woo and touchy-feely, when really there is a
Right.
lot of actionable, practical ways that you can depolarize that don't have to get all what somebody might call touchy-feely. And you
That's
guys,
absolutely
people
right.
like you,
That's a
yeah,
criticism leveled against the field, right? Which is just
yeah,
that, it's not doing anything. It's not taking a position, right? It's kind of
right.
like an antithetical to actually being in the world, either politically or civically. And that is not the case. It is an actual third way, and it's active and growing and addressing the beliefs and needs of people, right? We at DepolarWise say, be passionate about your beliefs and needs, but without partisan purity. And so helping people understand that they can find a third way without letting go of what's important to them and actively work on what's important to them within the depolarization and bridge building context is really important. The last thing I'll say, you did ask, like, when was Depolarized founded or launched? Coincidentally, it was launched just within the few months that Merriam-Webster had announced that polarization was the word of the year early last year, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
and how do they pick the word of the year? They look at these surges in searches for a term. So people were actually like hungry and searching for answers of what was happening to this country. And that is, I think, the very start of this journey, that people are saying, what is this? What does it mean? What's happening here? And so to provide that resource for people that are hungry to not just understand it more from a practical level, right? So we explain the difference between political and effective polarization, for example. We kind of give content of basic knowledge, but to say there are next steps. Once you know about this, there's something you can do to engage with it in a constructive way, was the gap we were trying to fill.
Right. And the point you just brought up about, you know, teaching people that they don't have to go against their values. I think that's a very important thing too, that we don't necessarily do as good of a job as we could about demonstrating, as in the depolarization movement as a whole, because sometimes people think, oh, so I have to go against my morals, and a lot of times they have that moralized attitude that leads them to that extreme view. And here for us depolarizers, it's like, no, it's not about that. It's just not having purity for the sake of having purity, and for being able to at least understand why other people come from where they come from. There's nothing wrong with having an opinion. It's just an opinion, but it's just when you assert some sort of moral superiority and think that other people are stupid or evil for having that different opinion, that's where we draw the line. But there's nothing wrong with having
Exactly.
opinions, exactly. But speaking of trying to get these people to depolarized. There is some debate about how many people can be persuaded or broken out of their echo chambers, these echo chambers being a huge reason why polarization gets to fester more and more. And certainly, there are some people that are just never going to be convinced of something that goes against what they believe, even if it's just a tiny little bit. They just won't budge. But in your opinion, do you think that there's like a rough estimate of the number or percentage of people that you think can potentially be successfully encouraged to be less polarized, or do you not really quite think of it in those terms?
No, I think that's an important question because, we want to put the effort and time and energy into receptive ears, right? And we know
Hmm.
that it can be kind of a fool's errand to keep hitting your head against the most extreme cases and feeling like you're not making progress. So at DepolarWise, we do track, pay attention to different polls and data that are coming out of organizations like Pew Research or More in Common, and so that some of the ones that we found, and then we post, when we agree post on our social media so that we can see some kind of transparency on where the majority of Americans really are on things. Some of the recent ones have been like, 8 and 10 of us believe that civility in political dialogue is actually necessary for the functioning of our democratic republic. 71% feel that we have more in common as citizens than we have that divides us. About the same amount feel personal responsibility to connect with diverse viewpoints of people on the other side. And over 80% say that protecting our democracy actually requires working across divides. So I think what we see is this around 70% marker of people who are willing, have this kind of mindset, this latent mindset there, and therefore are willing to engage in this type of work. Uh, that's a very hopeful thing for me, and that's about that 70% I think we should be concentrating on. But I will say that 30% ish that is not included in the numbers we were just talking about, it makes me wonder if that's pretty equivalent to the base of both parties. And we know that the base of the parties has a real outsized impact on our political process and the media that undergirds that political process. And I know with your background in election research and everything, that 30%, I wonder how that resonates with you, of like just kind of the base and the most polarized among us, and how they impact the way we see what has prominence in this country.
Yeah, it's something around. Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask, but some people say 30 or 40. Some people say that there's really not anybody persuadable, which I don't believe in. But it is to your point about the election research background. It is a lot like how elections in general are when you're trying to win a campaign for a candidate, where some voters, there's no point in trying to reach out to them because they are never going to step across the aisle. They are dead set on voting for your opposition. But also, there's not really, you got to be careful not to reach out too much to the people who are already going to vote for you because they're already there. You have finite resources to
Right.
reach those other people that are persuadable. So I think sometimes we also have to be careful as depolarizers, where when we are, I mean, I think the depolarization movement is picking up steam, don't get me wrong, but I think sometimes when we talk about depolarization, we highlight people who are already depolarized, or at least are less prone to polarization, whereas we need to reach more of those people we haven't reached before. I don't know if that quite
That's an excellent point.
makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
good. Because I wasn't quite
absolutely.
sure if I was getting the point across, but
Yes.
it is
So, I mean,
definitely
we
something
don't
to think
want
about.
to kind of burn resources on the people that just, it's too fundamentally part of their worldview that there's this good and evil binary in our politics too. But we want to create spaces for the people who are already the exhausted majority, or open and receptive to this. And then, sometimes when the majority moves to a new mindset and a new position, it brings the stragglers along with it, when that movement is very apparent and motivating for others to maybe take a second look.
Yeah, and every once in a while you do get those people who were super obstinate and they come over, and hopefully, that's what happens now. But we at least give them the resources to pick up on it, and then they can decide for themselves. But human beings, and try not to say this in a cynical way, because this doesn't have to be anything selfish, but human beings are often driven by motivations and incentives, just whatever they by whatever it's they think something is right, or there's doesn't have to necessarily have to be some sort of selfish gain. But clearly some people find polarization and toxicity appealing. They revel in it. So what are 2 to 3 of the biggest reasons why you think some people want to be polarizing, even if they don't think they are?
Right. So I mean, I think unfortunately, it fundamentally comes down to brain science, right? So we have evolved to have our framework, our evolutionary mental framework, be what supports being in an in group. Because at a certain time, our very survival was about being consistent and embraced by the tribe, right? So we have evolution of how our brain actually functions that supports and promotes, pushes us toward in group thinking and to tribal acceptance. So, for example, when we get confirmation bias, right? When we thought something and then we see something that validates that confirmation bias, we get a little dopamine hit in our brains. Motivated reasoning, right? So we see something that doesn't support our confirmation bias, but then we are able to kind of twist those facts to a point where we get that alignment with our original thinking. We get another dopamine hit, and people have done research on functional MRIs to see how our brain responds to us validating our pre-existing beliefs. So that's a difficult thing to overcome. And we can talk, kind of solutions later. But I would say that fundamental biology, we're actually up against that, and that in group tribal kind of brain science reward system that just kind of naturally pulls people into to a polarizing mindset. And we've seen that really accelerate with social media, right? So we've ported all this brain science from our small tribal communities into this massive social media and media complex. So we're still looking for that in-group validation. We're still looking for those dopamine hits. So how attractive is it if something's toxic and you share it and you get all this feedback, right? This positive feedback. When you share something polarizing and you get all these likes because you're in that community that's validating that conflict. And I think in the worst extremes, what we're seeing people who are motivated by money, right? We've monetized social media, and they're finding that this kind of clickbait, or what you would call rage bait, right? It sells, and it brings an attention economy your way that has its own rewards. So those incentives are very, very attractive. And also, I will say, incidentally, also signposts to what we saw in Colombia. Far before we did, they had bifurcated media, partisan radio and partisan newspapers. So they were in these kind of echo chambers validating their own community narrative, and that builds on itself, right? I think the last thing is what I would call the efficacy illusion, right? So we have this idea that if we win, and if we have like total control and hegemony over the systems, right? The judicial systems, the electoral systems, and the presidential, the White House and the Congress, that we need that to get anything done in this country. So that efficacy illusion is we need, it's war, and we've got to win it unequivocally so we can get what we want done, right? So we can get our beliefs and our needs met. Unfortunately, it is ultimately illusion, because in a society where you have this binary, where you have this switching back and forth between parties, the other party comes in and spends all of its time undoing what the last party did. So you might have this moment where you think, oh, look what we did, how effective it was. And then 4 years, 8 years later, it's all unraveled. I mean, it makes me think, from my St. John's background, of Penelope in the Odyssey, right? She's making the tapestry during the day and she's unraveling it during the night. And so this illusion of efficacy of building something tricks us into thinking that we're making durable change on issues that are really important to this country, when in fact, we're not. It's just a temporary moment that's going to be undone because we haven't created consensus change that's actually going to stay, that's going to last, and that's going to prevent blowback in the next cycle of power.
All great points to bring up, and maybe not so much on the efficacy part, but on the the whole tribalism and general brain science with the in groups and out groups. Unfortunately, that's something that can happen to us as depolarizers too if we're not careful. I mean, it can happen to anybody. I every once in a while I'll think of a time where I fell into that. I'm a big sports fan, so I get
Mhm.
into that all the time where I see a fan base of a team I hate, and I just get all these are such annoying, stupid people, blah blah blah. Now I
Yes.
sometimes do that about my own fan base, but and I can sometimes display the same behavior too, and I have to obviously be more self aware and careful about that. But it is obviously, a lot of it goes to being self-aware about that, right? I think a lot of depolarizers are a lot more self-aware about that in-group out-group tendency, whereas polarizers, even if the polarizers they don't really care. They're just like, well, my in-group is right about everything, of course. And then with the efficacy part, just that whole all or nothing prospect. And even when I think sometimes even when you tell polarized people that, they're still convinced that eventually they're just going to just keep the ball rolling in perpetuity, and that, the other side's not going to win. We're going to be able to keep this train rolling, and we're going to be able to just dictate everything that happens.
That
So
is
sometimes I think they
very
don't
true.
really, yeah, they don't really think that the ball is going to swing the other way, even though it inevitably does. So now, how do we take those reasons that you just described for being polarized, and how do we turn them around? So in other words, what are 2 to 3 ways we can reverse those reasons for being polarized and encourage and incentivize those people to be less polarizing and to start building bridges across political divisions?
Yeah, very important question. So I think that we are not at the point in our evolution where we can just expect people to opt out of brain science, right? Like we know this
Yeah.
exists, we know this framework exists, we know how this is how it works. So my personal opinion is like if you can't beat it, join it, right? And how can we leverage that brain science for the positive directionality of bridge building and depolarization? So let's just take again social media as a micro example. So we do have a choice. And it's kind of like a low effort choice, which is like, am I going to follow, like, promote, amplify conflict entrepreneurs and toxic dialogues? Or am I going to find another in group that is amplifying bridge building narratives, unity, but not monolith narratives, right? Would like, again, because this is not
Right.
about everybody thinking alike and the hegemony and winning the worldview. This is about saying, I think we can actually be different and work together. And actually that's a strength and not a weakness, right? So you find social media accounts, find media accounts that are amplifying this bridge building and depolarization dialogue, and get your dopamine hits by sharing and liking and engaging with a new in group. This in group is real and it's growing. I'll give you a couple examples. Of course, everyone is really welcome and encouraged to connect with DepolarWise on social media, but just seeing the growth in this last year, right? Bridge USA just on Instagram is up to over 70,000 followers.
Oh,
Builders
nice.
just in this year is up to over 360,000 followers.
Yeah.
So there's a community there of people that are going to be interested and forming this in group for your likes and your shares and your amplification of this worldview. And I say, yeah, again, if that's important to you, if you need that, if you just, it's just like coffee to you, and you get, I got that like, I got that share, just change the in group that you're part of to a constructive one that's actually working to fix this, the problems that we have in this country. The second thing I'll say, and it's more high effort, but it's directly engaging in working on achieving supraordinate goals across unlikely coalitions, right? So there's a video on DepolarWise that I encourage people to watch, and it's in like our what to watch section. So if you like video content, it's there for you. It's from Carnegie Mellon researchers on this topic. And they talk about, which goes back to what you were saying earlier, the kind of initial thinking around depolarization was like, how can we make efforts to just make people get along better, like be nicer to each other, and and just kind of kumbaya, or these like the soft woo-woo stuff you were talking about. And what the research is really showing, especially from other countries, is that doesn't fix it. What fixes it is getting unlikely coalitions, people that you wouldn't think agree with each other, and giving them a goal that's bigger than the the micro goals that these communities have. So a superordinate goal that everybody goes, yeah, I want to solve that. Maybe my beliefs and needs around it are different than your beliefs and needs around it, but we want to get at that and we need to fix it. So just give a concrete example. Maybe I'm invested in immigration reform because I have family here who are undocumented. They are kids, they grew up here, and I want to give them a path to citizenship to be productive members of the society going forward. Maybe someone else is interested in immigration reform because they want safety in their community. They don't want human trafficking or drug trafficking. And they were like, we got to get at this because there's dangers. So both of those are valid beliefs and needs, right? But both, when you get to that superordinate goal, we're both talking about like good solid immigration reform and protecting our borders while also giving people opportunity. Like, we can find those points of commonality as we work towards solving that problem together. And, surprisingly, we've been very close to that in the past. But we just haven't been able to land the plane on it because we've been going in the wrong direction with polarization. Americans in general have very similar kind of policy because we're a very practical nation, right? We're just like, yeah, like I think people should have the right to bear arms. I also think there should be some restrictions around stuff that's a little beyond the pale. So we can get to, and Tennessee 11 is another video or movie documentary I would encourage. We can get to some common solutions. It doesn't mean everybody gets everything they want, but it means that we can move forward on positive change that isn't going to have that blowback and that yo-yo effect because we've made something that's more durable with more voices, more ideas incorporated in that policy solution. So nothing works on depolarization like working toward common goals and solving problems.
And when you work towards those common goals, sometimes you find your seemingly completely disparate policy views really aren't so mutually exclusive. You can actually potentially work towards at least achieving somewhat of both sides' interests in that regard. But obviously, like you said, none of us can get everything that we want. It's just not how politics works, at least not if you want it to move forward. The thing you said about unity, not a monolith, I wish I had come up with that specific way to put it, because I really like it putting it that way, because sometimes people do, especially polarized people, think unity as in unity within our specific worldview, and then you got some even hardcore Republicans, hardcore Democrats that complain about their party not being conservative enough if it's Republican, or liberal enough if it's Democrat, and then you've got those supposed rhinos and dinos that people like to use as pejorative terms for those. So I think also it is important to show that depolarization is not about being a monolith. It's just a general unified purpose of, hey, we don't need to be at each other's throats all the time. And in fact, a lot of us don't have the same views on how what is the best policy, but we do have a common purpose that is unifying us, which is to at least try an earnest attempt to find the best policy and to actually incorporate everybody's views so they at least feel like they've been heard. And so,
yes,
you talked before, shifting gears a little bit more to, you've talked before in a TED Talk and in other forums, and then, of course, just now on the podcast about your mother's experience in Colombia during La Violencia, their civil war. And unfortunately, political violence and the threat of it has become more commonplace in American society, like with the assassinations of Melissa Hortman and Charlie Kirk, and the attempted assassinations of Donald Trump and Josh Shapiro, and countless other instances similar to those. But not every polarized person goes quite that far. Some of them just stick to yelling on the internet. So what do you think ultimately gets people to cross that line into supporting or even engaging in political violence? And how do we more effectively discourage or push back against that specifically?
Yes, I think this is, to me personally, it's a question we need to be seriously asking ourselves and actively working on, because it is getting more real here. Um, and it's, to me, it's like a genie out of a bottle type of Pandora box, or a tube out of a toothpaste situation. You can cross a threshold where it becomes so normalized you can't go back, right? So to try to disrupt political violence now is so important. You were just talking about the people that we're seeing right now subject to partisan violence are typically media personalities or politicians in some way. They have some very public persona. But I will guarantee you, just from the historical framework, that that doesn't stop there. So eventually it moves on to everyday partisan violence, citizen against citizen on the street violence. And so that doesn't wake us up. We think, well, this tall poppy syndrome, this person shouldn't have stuck their head out. They wouldn't have, someone wouldn't have tried to take a shot at it. It's like, no, this is the beginning of something that really can be, will affect all of our lives if we do not actively shut it down. So I think it's a recipe. So you have this collapsing of the continuity of political viewpoint and identity into binary extremes. Now you add three things. One, it's the threat narrative. So we've talked a little bit about conflict entrepreneurs and how they monetize this toxicity and polarization. Key to that is this threat narrative that is creating a worldview that the other side is dangerous to you, right? So they're not just annoying, they're not just misguided, they're not just, dumb. They're actually going to destroy the country. They're going to destroy your kids' futures. So we create this threat narrative, and unfortunately, sometimes there's a reality. Something real happens. Say in Colombia, there was an attack at the polls. Okay, so that really happened. And then what that turns into from the conflict entrepreneur framework is liberals are coming to kill you, conservatives are coming to kill you. When we get that threat narrative escalated to the point where you're seeing the other side as an active threat to your livelihood or your life, then your mindset becomes one of self-defense. And I feel strongly, and I believe the research supports this, that no one who takes their act of political violence thinks that they're an initiator. They don't think they're making the first strike. They think they're responding, right? They have a mindset of self-defense, and what they're doing is a response. You see that type of escalation in this country too. We label speech as violence, and then there's active violence as a response. They don't think that they're initiating that active violence. They think it's a response to other violence they've experienced. So that's why that vicious cycle of the threat narrative is so dangerous, because people are in a self-defense mindset, which has its own moral authority, right? The second part of the recipe is dehumanization. And, you recently had a guest on about pluralism who talked very articulately about that too. It cannot be overstated that when people who are different than you aren't just different than you, but they're evil, they're traitors, right?
No.
Subhuman, exactly. They're vermin, they're bugs, animals. Like we see this in other conflicts around the world, that human beings, their dignity is taken away, and then they're labeled as something that is subhuman. Exactly the right word. And what that does is it shuts down, it actually talking about brain science again, it shuts down the empathy centers in your brain. When you're not talking about another person as a wife, a mother, a daughter, but you're talking about them as a traitor, an enemy, and a cockroach, then your empathy centers have broke down. You don't have a human to human relationship with that. So that dehumanization is key. It allows us to turn the other way when we see political violence, and it is a tipping point to allowing something to perpetuate it. Then the third part of the recipe is really lack of faith in our institutions. And when you are seeing signs where you don't think you have the efficacy to improve problems in judicial systems and electoral systems, and you think there's no path there. There's no path to solving societal problems in our institutions anymore. Then what really does prevent you from going out into the street and trying to achieve the society you want in hand-to-hand combat, right? So there needs to be, if not faith in the institutions as there has to be faith in the institutions as we can change them for the better, right? We have to have faith in the voter booth. I'll tell you what really, there was partisan violence in rural areas in Colombia, but what really blew the lid off was a presidential candidate was assassinated, that people had invested a lot of hopes in resolving issues in the country, like the disparity between the wealthy and the poor. And so when they saw that, they said, forget it. Electoral system is not going to help us. Judicial system's not going to help us. There's no institution that's going to actually improve our lives. So we're going to the streets with it in a very violent way. Okay, how do we stop that? I mean, those are very big issues. I will say that in terms of the threat narrative, opting out of perpetuate the conflict entrepreneur and taking situations as isolated, terrible things have happened. Terrible things will happen, but not putting that as part of like a whole in-group intention of violence to another in-group, right? Secondly, with the dehumanization, we feature the dignity index on DepolarWise. That is a really important way to understand and moderate our own language and to vet how other people's language is removing the humanity of people or granting them humanity. We are going to be disagreeing in this country, hopefully for the rest of the time that we are before until the sun explodes, right? This is going to be a country that has conflict and that needs to embrace conflict because it's a strength for how we improve ourselves. But how we express ourselves in that conflict, whether we're saying, you have no human dignity, or whether we're granting human dignity in that disagreement, there's some very tactical, specific things you can do in language to make sure that's happening. The dignity index just nails it. And then I think the last thing is we have to have zero tolerance to political violence. We cannot brush it away or excuse it when it's happening from our side. It has to be as abhorrent to us, whether our side is perpetuating it or whether the other side is perpetuating it. We start cutting ourselves slack there, we're just opening a door we can't close.
You could have an entire conversation on each one of those points you just brought up, but the ones I specifically focus on, the one you just talked about, and then the whole threat narrative is that, when Melissa Hortman was assassinated, there's so much talk about, look how violent conservatives are, and then Charlie Kirk got assassinated, and then it's like, look how violent liberals are, and with complete lack of self-awareness and sincerity and no sarcasm at all. They really thought it was just, it's always that side that's starting it. Never them.
Yes.
They are always the ones that are, like you said at the very beginning, they are the ones who are reacting like, it's not me. Look, I'm just doing what I have to do. And
Yes.
that's a hard thing to break people from. And you do have to kind of lead them to understanding that, no, this is how you're viewing things. We need to be able to recognize that this is a problem that all of us are contributing to. And when you talked about how we need to recognize our side, first, and not just their side, that's one of my big things I try to stress too, is accountability. There's no real accountability unless you're actually holding your side to those same standards. It's not accountability when you're
so well said.
only yelling at other people. Yeah, it's because you're just yelling at them because they have different viewpoints, not because they actually did something wrong. And until a lot more people are willing to hold their sides accountable, we're not going to have real accountability. And you're going to have more and more politicians and activists try to toe the line, try to step over that line because they don't think anybody's going to push back on them, at least not anybody in their camps. And something I emphasize in my work is how every one of us can improve how we engage with each other politically. We're all human. We all make mistakes. And I think there are still some people who really want to bring down toxicity in politics. And I'm not going to say that I haven't made these mistakes, because I have, and to build bridges, but we can still accidentally be polarizing. We accidentally inflame polarization when we mean to tamp it down. So what are your thoughts about that? And how do you think we can encourage depolarizers and bridge builders to be more self-aware, to make sure they are making healthy contributions to political discourse?
That's so important, because for better or for worse, you are a model. Like, you're going to be held to a different standard if you're proclaiming that you're doing this work, and so you have to walk the talk, right? I mean, before we get into like how we can improve our own practice, I do have to say though that I am the biggest fan of people working in bridge building and depolarization and civic education and civic renaissance work. I my respect and my gratitude for this group of professionals and volunteers is boundless. They're doing incredibly important work. They're doing incredibly timely work. They're leading us into uncharted territory, right? And they are building a plane while they're flying it. So those are my people. to the extent that even that DepolarWise is starting to pivot now into how we can help professionals and high-level volunteers continue to do the work that they do and support them, right? So we've recently created a group on LinkedIn called the Bridging and Civic Solutions Exchange. And the gap we're trying to fill, right, is that depolarization and bridge building, it's not a field, it's not a sector, right? LinkedIn does not recognize it as a separate entity. And we're kind of fractured, ironically, into, are you a media person in this space? Are you in education in this space? Are you doing membership organization? Are you in a nonprofit? So there's really not like a center point for this group. So we're trying to fill the gap of helping people find each other easier in LinkedIn, providing job postings for the sector, providing conferences, amplifying conventions that are happening, and announcing funding opportunities for this space. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for us all to connect. The group is now, I'm going to call it small but mighty. It's really new. We're pushing forward, but we have leaders from some of the top organizations there already. More in Common, Braver Angels, builders. So we're having people there that I'm hoping can start to trade their expertise with each other and support and amplify this as a profession. Because ultimately, what's my dream? That we're able to attract the best and brightest into this sector, into this emerging field, because we're going to need those minds working as passionately on this problem as they have been working as passionately on the divide, right? So let's take those best and brightest and put them in a different place and incentivize that and show that there's a sector, a field, and an opportunity to be part of a community and make a livelihood with it, right? So, okay, that's all my gushing about bid builders and depolarizers, because I love them. So how can we improve our practice? I think that there's two things that pop out to me most pressingly, I think, again, in terms of modeling and walking the talk. I think we need to remember that this is a journey, right? Like, and we're really far down in the journey, and we're looking back and now everything's clear, right? Hindsight's 2020. Like, this is so obvious to us. Why would anybody be supporting toxicity? Why would anybody be supporting partisanism? Like, it's just, but we've given ourselves the time to pass through that journey and learn how we learned to get to this point, right? So we want to go back and we just want to pluck people from the beginning of the journey and plop them down at the end of the journey. And that is not realistic, and it's not respectful, right? So having a lot of patience and respect for people's uncomfortability, like their hesitation, their trepidation engaging with the other side, having patience and respect for people maybe not being ready right away, or kind of not understanding that they can still get their beliefs and needs met in this movement. Just trying to have patience with their discomfort and their feelings as they move through this journey, right? Because that is a process. It takes time. And what we can do is hold their hands through it and provide them resources through it. But to have any type of intolerance that they're not where we are right now, it's not helpful. I would say that that's pretty similar to having to forwarding, how do I want to say this? Civic engagement or civil dialogue, civil discourse as a ends and not as a means, right? And so folks that aren't very wedded, like invested in this movement, when they hear us saying, just, be more polite, have more civil discourse, have more civil, like they hear, you're not doing anything, are you? Like, you just want us to get along better. This is not going to solve my problems. It's not. So I think we need to be very, very clear that things like the Dignity Index, things like civil dialogue, civil discourse, this kind of aspect of depolarization and bridge builders that's trying to be welcoming and tolerant is not a excuse not to work on the hard issues and not to solve the hard problems. And I think for us, centering solving the hard problems as the end and the kind of way in which we do the work as the means also can help build credibility in the space and bring more people into it.
I will also vouch for the LinkedIn group that Phelosha just highlighted there. I'm actually in that group as well, and it is a point that I think needs to be made more, and I should be making the point more often too, is having this depolarization space be treated as its own separate thing, and it would also help to really legitimize the space, even in the minds of people who might not be quite as given to depolarizing, they start to see that it's starting to gain more legitimacy. They might start to see, oh, you know what? Maybe I should go check it out. I think also something that I was just going to shamelessly plug I have a 5-day educational email course that actually talks a little bit about this kind of thing.
Yes.
Now a lot of what Phelosha talked about, I touch on a little bit in the EEC, but it's basically just about some of the mistakes we make as depolarizers that can actually accidentally inflame polarization and how we can actually fix those ways that we go about. But like, because you were talking about how we can be intolerant of people not moving along as fast as we want them to.
Yes, ironically, right?
Yeah, exactly.
True.
It's just like we're being intolerant of the people that we're trying to get out of intolerance. And I kind of think about, because I coach at my local YMCA on the side, and and I do various sports, basketball and flag football in particular, because those are the ones that I'm most skilled at myself. But if you're trying to teach a kid how to dribble a basketball and how to shoot, and how to defend somebody, some people will get that stuff a lot quicker than other people. Some just have innately more of a talent to understand it, and some other people you got to work with a little bit longer. Not everybody's journey is the same. So it's just basically just like what you had said about bringing people along that journey. So I think that's a really neat way to put it. There's something else that I think bridge builders and depolarizers don't account for enough, is we don't really effectively show polarized people, or people that are at major risk of being polarized, why polarization actually hurts them in the long run. They a lot of times just see it as, well, I'm just benefiting somebody else. This doesn't benefit me. So what are 2 to 3 ways or methods that you think we can use to discourage and disincentivize people from being polarized, by showing them that it doesn't actually benefit them as much as they think?
Right. So, I mean, the one that always just pops out to me, and I've said this before, it's like these, these partisan politicians and these, kind of toxic conflict entrepreneurs that you follow. They're not going to be there at your bedside when you're sick, right? And we have seen real and tangible loss of relationship, people letting go of not just friends but family, uh, due to their devotion to these people on the partisan divide, and that to me is heartbreaking. Monica Guzman, and this is a book we feature on DepolarWise as well. I never thought about that way. Talks about her relationship with her very, she's living in Portland, very liberal. Her parents are immigrants, very conservative, and people actually told her, like, why do you still talk to your parents? And that to me is it's mind blowing, right? Like that we've gotten to the point where this political identity, supersedes our families, right? And that's a real and tangible harm to people. And it may, when you're young and you're healthy and you're moving around the country, you may say, meh, but get older, and find out who's very valuable in your life and who's actually going to be there for you. That is a sacrifice that is just really it's not worth making, right? I think the second thing I would point out is what I'm going to call like a cortisol tax, right? So when we're constantly engaged in outrage, like that's gonna affect your body, right? That's your insomnia and your anxiety and all this is stuff that it has tangible harms to your health for no trade-off, right? Like we're not actually accomplishing anything. So, if you were spending all this cortisol to get yourself out of a burning building, good job, but we're spending all this cortisol to just be outraged. And I just don't think that we're going to see positive outcomes from a societal perspective from that. And I think we're going to see a lot of negative outcomes from a health perspective of this. And there have been some studies linking polarization and toxicity to psychological health. And I think physical health is not far behind. The last thing I'll just kind of point back to this like yo-yo of change and the efficacy illusion, right? Like has this really solved problems that you care about in this country? Has it really addressed if you are worried about, the gap, the lack of opportunity now, the lack of the American dream, or the gap between wealth and the poor, and like how it's harder for your children to have a better life than you did? Like, has it made tangible gains? Has this approach actually improved your life? And I would go a little bit further and tap on it and say, who's benefiting from this? right? If you really look at your personal individual life, are you benefiting from it? Is it increasing your health and your wealth and your opportunities? Or is it actually a real interesting tool for people who want to capture the attention economy, for people who want to garner votes, for people who want to distract us from maybe issues like economic disparities in this country? Like, who is it benefiting? Follow the money. And I think
Yeah.
if you're not making money off of it, who is? And I hope that that really opens people's eyes to the deficits of this kind of mindset, mentality, or lifestyle.
Cortisol tax is another phrase I wish I had come up with. And if I ever use that, I'm going to credit you for that, because I don't want to take credit for that.
Oh,
But
thank you.
to the beginning of what you were saying there, the whole, yeah, separating yourself from friends and family because of politics. I think about even back when I was really young and I was very obnoxious, very opinionated about politics. Even then, I had quite a few friends that were not of the same political persuasion as me. And then we'd get into stupid Facebook arguments. It's just, why did we waste our time with those? But never once did I think about saying, you know what, screw this person. I'm not even going to communicate with them
Yep.
at all anymore. That just, even at my most obnoxious, I couldn't fathom about how somebody could do that, especially when you have
Yeah.
like
Just
such a
cut
strong
off.
relationship. Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's, and again, it goes back to, it's fine to be passionate about politics. In fact, you should have some core values that are your guiding principles. But when it comes to the point where that overtakes your identity and it leads you to dehumanize people that don't share those same values, that's where we've got to step back a little bit and reevaluate things. And
Absolutely.
one of yeah, and one of the best antidotes, I think, to polarization, including those points that you had just made, is civic education for and engagement by a wider variety of people. We see plenty of studies that have linked civic education to less polarized views and being able to think about nuance and details. But improving civic engagement can be a very difficult task. Actually, my guest I just had before you talked about improving civic engagement. We talked about how it can be such a difficult, arduous task. And some people don't want to or are afraid of getting politically or involved politically for various reasons, whether they feel like they're personally going to be threatened, for example. What are 2 to 3 ways that we could encourage and motivate more people to be more civically involved and therefore beat back polarization?
Yes, and I think the phrasing you're using is so important, right? Like being civically involved is there's a lot of daylight between that and being political, right? And engaging in politics. And for
Yeah,
this exhausted majority, it's like, I don't want like, but if we start to further this idea of like civic engagement, like that to me feels accessible. And that to me feels like it's
yeah,
stuff that you can do without getting in any type of political fray. So I would say the first two things, like go local, right? The
hmm,
more national we get, I think the more we're subjected and also prone to more of this outreach machine and less of the actual getting things done. So
absolutely.
the more local you can be, I think your pluralism guest that you recently had made such a compelling case for mutual aid, right? So, like when you're working on mutual aid, nobody's checking your voter card at the door. If you're at the food pantry giving out food, if you're helping clean up after a fire, that's like apolitical. Work locally on matters that provide mutual aid, improve your neighborhood, improve your community. That doesn't have to be about winning or losing a political battle. And then, like, similarly, just like lower the stakes, right? So, our local Brave Little Angels group here in New Mexico, they have a documentary night. You just watch a film and talk about it, right? Other people are having potlucks. You could have a food event between two different churches or a church and a synagogue or a mosque and just eat together. You don't have to talk about any of the serious issues. Just get to know each other. So I think lowering the stakes is really important. I'll do a shameless plug now for my day job organization. So St. John's
Please do.
College does a summer classics event every year where people come around from the country, adult learners. They're not in degree programs, and they spend a week or more either in person or online talking about great work that they're very interested to get to know. And I think this year, to your question, we have a great opportunity with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration to spend some
Hmm.
time in company and reflection of the great works that have shaped America, either because of good, positive criticism that we needed, or to try to reach our aspirational ideals. So, you can come find us at sjc.edu/classics, read the foundational text with other people who are interested in it, read great American novels and see how that shaped this country, engage with the soul of Black folk or Native American films when you want that alternative perspective of the experience of this country, and just really spend time with other people in this. We're going to, we call our theme this year the pursuit of happiness, right? Like really appreciating the opportunity of this country and our own kind of journey within it, by being part of this continuity of people who have criticized it, loved it, written about it, made films about it, and just be part of that conversation that's ongoing and will, outlast us.
And even just doing those things will mean at least a little bit more civic engagement. But that is a very important distinction that you made there. Civic engagement does not mean being political. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with getting political, but you can still be civically involved without having to support a specific issue or support a specific candidate for office. Just getting people to try to think more about these things, just informing them about what's going on and why people think one way and why people think another way. All forms of civic engagement, or at least you trying to understand why people might think differently than you without trying to come with a predisposed way of thinking of why they believe what they believe, which, I mean, that can happen to all of
Absolutely.
us, but a very salient point that you made there. We're running a little low on time, so I'm going to give one more question before the random question of the day that I like to end interviews with. But on your website, I found an interesting list of signature talks and topics on DepolarWise that you have given previously, and one of those was bridge building as a daily meditative practice. Now, obviously, I don't want you to give away all those secrets. I want you to be actually able to give that whole thing there, if somebody comes to look for that talk. But what are 2 to 3 tips from that you can share so that people can build up a habit of bridge building and depolarizing?
Yes, thank you, thank you. I think it's so important, especially as when you're working in the field as professionals and you're human and you're like, oh, this is hard. I think breath work is a fundamental part of our
Yeah.
toolkit. Just taking one breath between stimulus and response, as Viktor Frankl would say, right? Just one breath between those two things is so helpful for grounding ourselves in our intentions and in the way that we want to execute on this work. So I highly advocate breath work and just taking that breath when you're feeling those very human, very natural emotions. The other thing I'll say about meditation is it's about self-observation, right? And self-observation, we've talked about this whole conversation, right? Like, how do we look at ourselves both as citizens? How do we look at ourselves as professionals in bridge building and depolarization? And taking that time to just like observe your thoughts before you act on them, right? Observe your emotions, before you believe them, as truth. And, observe your beliefs before you defend them, right? And so that practice of self-observation and that little bit of distance between what feels initially natural to you, but creating that space for something else, even in yourself. I think that meditative practice of self-observation can be a really helpful tool for us in this field.
Breath work is something I am very bad about not doing. I definitely need to do that much more often, in particular, not even just with politics, just with stuff in general.
Yes.
I fell off the meditation wagon a while ago. I really need to get back on it, so I will definitely
It's
try to
hard.
incorporate
It's
those
really hard.
things.
That's why I like things like breath
Yeah,
work, because I like my brain can go somewhere. It's like you are just breathing. You're not trying to clear your mind. Forget it. It's impossible. But you can
yeah,
focus on breathing. And that is
yeah,
helpful.
yeah. You're letting the thoughts come and acknowledging them, but you're not trying to do anything
Yes.
specific with them. You're just, oh, that's there. Okay. Then
Yep.
next thought
Yep.
comes
And it
in.
gives you compassion
Absolutely.
for other people, right? Because you're like, that's how their brain's working too. Sometimes stuff's just coming in it and they're going to say that stuff and, have some compassion that maybe that's just passing through.
Yeah, absolutely. I really want to thank you for your time, for giving all your insights about this, Phelosha. So we're going to go ahead and wrap things up now, because I like to always end interviews with a random question of the day. And for those of you who are new to the podcast, it's just a fun, random, non-political, or if it is political, it's not going to be anything like controversial or anything like that. I just like to get a different side of the guest and just showcase a different side and humanize them a little bit, like we've been talking about in this discussion. And also, some of this stuff can be a little bit harrowing, so let's add some levity to it. So, yes. Phelosha, for you, the random question of the day is: if your safety and return to Earth were guaranteed, what planet would you visit and why?
Ooh, what planet would I visit and why? Oh God, I just feel like everyone's so focused on Mars. We need to think about a different star here that we wanna shed some light on. I think if my safety was guaranteed, I would want to check out uh uh Jupiter, because you see that storm in the middle of that planet and you just think, this planet has a soul. Something's going on. There's turmoil there. It's just so dynamic, right? And I think that plus that and the gravity, right? Like, what is that experience like? In a planet that is just plus, in all the Greek and Roman mythology, right? That's Zeus. That's the big guy. That's the one that's really holding our gravitational system together. So let's give some respect to our big planet in our solar system.
Yeah, the Great Red Spot is an astounding fact about the solar system. I believe it's bigger than Earth, and it's just this giant, like 200-mile-per-hour wind storm. And then the really freaky thing about planets like Jupiter is there's no solid surface to land on. It's all gas. I'd love to go see every planet if my safety was guaranteed, as freaky as some of it would be. But for me, if we're just going to keep it in the solar system, because there's some exoplanets that are just super wild that we've studied from afar, of course. But if we're just going to stick in the solar system, it would be Venus. So Venus is I was a big astronomy nerd as
also
a kid,
a gas planet, right?
Yeah. No, so Venus, Venus is covered in noxious gases, but it is a terrestrial planet.
Solid.
Once you get past, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, yes, Neptune, those are the gas planets, and then
gas giants. Wow.
Or gas giants. So those are the gas giants, and then Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and then if you're still obstinate about Pluto, my pluralist guest you talked about Liz Vogel. We actually had a little discussion about Pluto, but if you still consider Pluto a planet, which I do too, those are the terrestrial planets. So those are the ones that actually have a surface. But I picked Venus because I think Venus is just the really most interesting, because it is so covered in noxious gases, and because the pressure there is really high. We've had very limited ability to actually scan the surface. I believe it was the Soviets that were the first to actually break through, and they got a probe there. So we do actually have a few photos from the surface from whichever probe it was that they sent there. It's just because of that level of mystery. I just really want to see it, and then just to get a sense of what that's like. But of course,
I love that.
Even though every planet would be dangerous to live on, that'd be one of the most dangerous. Well, I mean, of course, the gas giants, you don't have anything where to land on, but Venus. And then also there's just very interesting other aspects about Venus. Like, for one, it rotates the exact opposite way that all the other planets do. I think Uranus does as well. And the day on Venus is also longer than its year, because it rotates slower than it revolves around the sun. So rotation
that's
is
crazy.
The day. Yeah,
that's crazy.
It rotates slower than it revolves around the sun. It's a really fascinating planet. So But yeah, no, I appreciate getting to geek out about space, because I was a big space nerd when I was a kid. So really appreciate all your insights about depolarization. Thank you for humoring me with the question, the random question of the
my
day.
pleasure.
But we are going to have to wrap things up, as much as I'd like to keep going on. So thank you so much, Phelosha. Before we go, obviously I will link DepolarWise on this episode when it comes out, and as well as your TED Talk. Is there any other things that you want me to, any other links you want to share?
No, I would just say, come join us on social media. Come fill out our forms on Depolarize and let us know what you're thinking. And if you're working in the space, come join us on LinkedIn at the Bridging and Civic Solutions Exchange Group. We would love to have you. And thanks for your time and for your listeners' engagement. I am so grateful we had this conversation. I always find it so energizing to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really thank you for being on there. So yeah, I will also link that LinkedIn group as well. So my links, my LinkedIn profile, I post on there quite frequently. My Facebook page, Paul Rader, author and speaker. My 5-day educational email course that I brought up about in this talk about how we can more effectively depolarize politics and correct some of the mistakes we make when we try to depolarize that can sometimes accidentally inflame tension. My email, paulraderwrites@gmail.org. My website, paulrader.org. And I also have a book on Amazon. I realized I forgot to highlight that the last couple of episodes, but I have a book on Amazon about political independence and why they struggle so much with elections and how they could possibly mitigate those obstacles that you can buy on Amazon. It's not arguing for or against independence, but it just talks a little bit more about that from an impartial standpoint. So we are going to end this episode here now. So thank you again so much for all of you listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share the episode on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And we'll see you next time.